I am Twyla Tardif, and I am the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I am very pleased to welcome you to our 9th presentation in the virtual noon lecture series of our Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for fall 2020. Our complete series schedule is available on our website, and email reminders are sent out weekly. And so if you have not received an email reminder specifically for this talk and you'd like to be on our email list, then please do contact us. We'll begin today with a couple of announcements. I know this will be tragic for all of you, but as much as I love our noon lecture series, I am very grateful and give thanks to the fact that there will not be a lecture next week on Tuesday, November 24th, due to University of Michigan's Thanksgiving break. And I wish you all a Zoomless and or minimalist Zoom Thanksgiving week. So the next presentation in our noon lecture series will take place then in 2 weeks on December 1st and will be given by Brian Wu, who is Associate Professor of Strategy at U of M's Ross School of Business, and he will be speaking on designing online platforms for offline services in China, a market frictions-based perspective. With that, I will introduce today's speaker, who is Wen Yu, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. She received her PhD in history from Harvard University in 2018, and then she joined us for her postdoc. Her research focuses on China's social and political thought, ideological movements, and intellectual culture from the 17th century to the present. Her dissertation, The Search for a Chinese Way in the Modern World, From the Rise of Evidential Learning to the Birth of Chinese Cultural Identity, explores the roots and development of modern Chinese exceptionalism by tracing how the search for a Chinese cultural identity has become central to the intellectual debates over shared values in modern China. Her dissertation was awarded the 2017 Harold K. Gross Dissertation Prize and was a big part of why we invited her to join us here at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. Today, she's going to be speaking on constructing a China, nationalism and culture in modern history. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Twyla, for the introduction. And also, I want to thank Ina for making the lecture possible. And thank you all very much for joining me. I'm very excited to share my research with you today. And let me now share my screen. So the title of my talk today is Constructing a China, Nationalism and Culture in Modern History. It is part of my current ongoing book project, The Search for a Chinese Way in the Modern World, From the Rise of Evidential Learning to the Making of a Chinese Cultural Identity, from the 16,000 to 2020. The book examines why the search for a Chinese cultural identity became central to modern China's debates over values until the present day. And the book takes a long-duration research approach, as you can see. It tried to answer this question by going back to the 17th century. But in my talk today, I want to particularly focus on the late Qing period. And I want to show how my exploration of the rise of the pursuit of a Chinese cultural identity in the early 20th century can actually help us to better understand what is going on in China today. So it has two parts to it. So let me first show you a short video that was circulated during President Donald Trump's state visit to China in 2017. It captured an interesting conversation between him and President Xi Jinping when they were touring the Forbidden City in Beijing.
Say China 5,000 years it goes back, right?
Seems to be 5,000 years.
Right, 5,000 at least. And I guess the oldest culture they say is Egypt at 8,000,
对，埃及更古老一些，但是呢，文化没有断过流的，始终传承下来的只有中国。
But the Chinese civilization is different.
So this is your original form very much, yeah. It really is.
这就是原来的文化。
对，
Yeah.
就我们这些人也是原来的人，
And people like us,
黑头发、
we
黄皮肤
be traced back to
传承下
5,000
来
years
的，
ago.
我们叫龙的传人。
Red hair, yellow skin. We call ourselves the inheritance people going down from dragon. Sons and daughters of dragon.
That's great.
Okay. So the Central Chinese Television entitled this video clip as President Xi explains the meaning of the people descended from the dragon in such a way. China is, as Xi says, China is the only ancient civilization whose culture has never been disconnected from its origins. Hence, our people are also this way: black hair, yellow skin, and the people ascended from the dragon. So why is such an explanation important? The answer is that the video reveals what the government wants the public to see about its role, the protector and the inheritor of China's cultural heritages. It is no longer news that in the past decades, the Chinese Communist Party has drastically reinvented itself from its earlier role as the follower of a Marxist universal revolution to its new role as the inheritor of China's cultural legacies. For instance, in a speech on ideological building in 2013, President Xi stressed, Chinese culture encompasses the deepest cultural and ethical pursuit of the Chinese nation, nurturing the people for generations, rooted in Chinese culture. Socialism with Chinese characters represent the Chinese people's aspirations. Thus, it is inevitable for China, a country with a unique culture, history, and basic conditions, to choose a development path featuring its own characters. So comparing the party's ideological building today with the Mao era, we see a major transition. Mao was the red sign in the heart of all the revolutionary people from different cultures and with different identities. In contrast, Xi identified the party's socialist leadership primarily with the attitude and the culture of the Chinese. So even in the context of international politics since 2018, when the party feels defensible enough to push the idea of its leadership as also contributing to the community with shared future for mankind, 人类命运共同体, the party still makes sure that this ambition is substantiated by a deep Chinese attitude. For instance, an article published on People's Daily summarizes in this way. Chinese traditional culture emphasizes the principle of harmony. It is China's profound cultural gene as such that gives Chinese Communist Party a secret code for constructing the shared future for the mankind. Chinese Communist Party's turn to China's cultural traditions needs to be situated in a broad intellectual cultural transition since the early 1990s. Since then, China has witnessed an enormous growth of interest in defining the meaning of a Chinese cultural identity across various intellectual practices and disciplines. For instance, we see a national learning movement that aims to review the underlying Chineseness in China's textual cultural traditions. We see historians and archaeologists seek to uncover China's past based on Confucian classics. And we see the political theorists trying to find a China model to define the country's social political construction based on its own intellectual heritage. But what is the Chinese way? How should China's transition speak to its future? I think while their positions vary, intellectuals share the assumption that there are something unique to China's historical and cultural institutions, and that China's future ought to be based on this legacy. And the very viability of the debate has been offering an array of theoretical and historiographical sources for the politicians who have been searching for a new legitimizing discourse of political identity since the end of the Cold War. But Why did the debate over the Chinese identity came about, and what do intellectuals hope to achieve by participating in it? Is such an exceptionalist turn same as the many national populist movement we see happening today worldwide? Is there any deeper pattern to this debate? Will China's quest for values that can be claimed as uniquely Chinese actually create an alternative to existing liberal democratic values? I think to answer these questions, we need to go back to the historical moment when the political pursuit of the Chinese cultural identity was born. So intellectual leaders argue for taking seriously China's own cultural legacies today have often identified themselves with thinkers as Liang Qichao and Zhang Taiyan, the key thinkers who defined modern Chinese national thought. Emerged during the reform period of the last years of the Qing dynasty, their discourse have shaped the ideologies of China's nationalist revolution that ended China's imperial system. The most important approach in existing scholarship has been to interpret modern Chinese national thought as a product of a Western-style modernization, a break from the Confucian tradition. However, this approach is not adequate, in my view. It doesn't help to explain the moral and the political meanings attached to the desire to reconnect with past. Instead, I believe a better way to pose the question is, in the late 19th and early 20th century, if cultural identity was proposed as an answer among the intellectuals, then what was the question? Now, to anticipate my conclusion, I show that national thought in the late 19th century and early 20th century was first and foremost concerned with the source of values and the role of the educated elite. And to get there, I will follow 3 steps. First, I will show how the debates over the role of the educated elite and source of values had shaped the political debates in China's late 19th century and early 20th century. Second, I will show why the idea of cultural identity was proposed as a meaningful choice. And third, I will discuss why such findings are important for us today to better understand their ideological visions and their impacts on the modes of their cultural productions in the 20th century. Now, this plan brings us back to the critical moment of the last decade of Qing in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the Chinese cultural elite argued for radical reform of China's imperial political culture due to the tremendous foreign pressure and domestic crises. Importantly, I discovered that the intellectual debate that had given meaning to the national thought was not so much about how to construct a Western-style industrial state. Instead, it was largely about how the Confucian literati could claim that only their learning tradition could provide a tradition or provide a doctrine for the construction of China's post-imperial social political order. How so? Let me explain. So since the mid of the 19th century, in the view of many reform-minded literati scholars, the reason why the Western nations have become so powerful had much to do with their political achievements, namely its modern representative politics and constitutionalism. But instead of seeing the system as an arrangement based on the European idea of political equality, literati scholars in China understood it primarily through a Confucian lens, namely seeing it as an example of the ultimate Confucian ideal of the meritocratic government, which China had failed to achieve due to the hereditary rulership of imperial dynasties. Such a meritocracy in the West had contributed to its economic power, cultural advantages, and social coherence. So in the eyes of those literati scholars, the system had enabled the West to base its politics on merit. Thus, it provided motivations and opportunities for their educated elites to develop their understanding about the world and the society. My point here is not that the Chinese had misunderstood the system of the West. What is important here is that the success of the West had provided an important justification for the Chinese literati community to pursue their own political participation as their goal of a constitutional reform. This conviction became especially significant after 1895, when Qing was defeated by the Japanese. A younger generations of progressive literati scholars launched what is often called the New Learning Movement. This is a generation of scholars who were both learned in the Confucian classics and histories and actively opened themselves to the traditions from the West as well. So not yet having established their positions through the exam system, they mobilized the greatest literati political activism in the last decade of the Qing. Kang Youwei was the primary leader and the mind behind the 100 Days Reform. On one hand, Kang and the followers argued that the learned elite, as the representative of the Min, the people, needs to gain access to a much broader political participation in political decision-making beyond the existing exam system. This also means to transform the existing practice of learning. On the other hand, they launched an ideological agenda that is to redefine the political role of the Confucian learning tradition from its current imperial form into a binding doctrine of meritocratic constitution. But this also means to transform the existing practice of learning that had been heavily focusing on the officials and the rulers' self-cultivation into a public-minded knowledge pursuit that concerned with the foundation of government and the institutional building. But in this process, two questions emerged. What tradition represents the true, legitimate, meritocratic Confucian tradition in political learning? And in what way could the literati community justify its political claim and the public power? To respond to these questions, a debate over the meaning of the literati learning traditions and the shared values emerged in the 1890s. And in this debate, two directions of Confucian commentary traditions became important choices. So the first is what I would like to call the Confucian moral universalism. By the end of the 19th century, this direction was represented by a coalition of the esoteric Gongyang New Text classicist and the New Confucian nationalist cosmology. And the second one, which is very important for understanding the roots of modern Chinese national thought, is what we can call the Confucian particularism or historicism, which was represented by the evidential learning tradition, 考证学, which dominated the center of intellectual culture since the 17th century. By the time of the late Qing, both directions had their different interpretations of the meaning of antiquity, the learning of the sages, and the different approaches to idealize the concept of what 中国 means, what China means. As we know, the new Confucian cosmology is firmly grounded on assumption that morality is real and universal, and as it is rooted in the biological connections of human beings with the universe. At the same time, the Gongyang New Text classical tradition claims that Confucius was the prophetic, uncrowned king whose access to the universal principles of heaven and earth enabled him to predict future and thus guide humankind. Historically, the New Confucians and the Gongyang scholars are two different schools, but they appeal to each other in the context of late Qing, particularly because they both insist that the universalistic and transcendentalist nature of Confucian learning is the only way to validate the political role of the cultural elite. In particular, they argue that the sages, Confucian sages who create China's antiquity, were the moral leaders or the spiritual interpreters who stayed unified with certain constant universals or forces of the cosmos, and their learning would eventually bring unity to the world. 中国, the political and cultural entity, is a model because it aims to represent the ultimate teachings of human life that are rooted in the universalistic movement of heaven and earth. But this naturalistic and universalistic assumptions of values was radically challenged by evidential learning thinkers as dogmatic, speculative, and prone to hypocrisy and abuse. Evidential learning, which first emerged in the 17th century as a historically minded tradition of social political thought, and later transformed into accumulative cultural historical scholarship in the 18th century, saw that the social political order is a historical product of the cumulative development of culture and institution of a community. So they argue that sages, the Confucian sages who built antiquity, were not spiritual interpreters who had access to revealed truth. Rather, they were historical actors who built political life to preserve the interest of their historical community. How could they do so? They could do so because they committed their learning to the interest of the community. They respected the social and cultural order formed in the community and helped the community to develop a meaningful sense of cultural consciousness or cultural identity in their construction of institutions. Thus, although the idea of Zhongguo is still a model for them, it is not because it offers any universalistic moral teachings, but because it exemplifies the growth of a successful, self-governing, and historical community. By the time of the arrival of the West in the mid-19th century, there had been a profound conflict between the evidential learning's conception of values as a cumulative historical product of the Chinese cultural community and the universalistic concept of values as predetermined universalist moral doctrines. It is important to identify this basic difference here, as they promise two different ways to validate the cultural elite's claim of agency in post-imperial China. It is in this moment we see the rise of three positions among the leading thinkers of the new learning movement, while Kang Youwei represents the position of Confucian universalism. As I will show, Liang Qichao and Zhang Taiyan advanced the position of the evidential learning in a very important way. So first, let's talk about Kang Youwei. So coming from the background of a combination of political Neo-Confucianism and the Gongyang tradition, Kang Youwei drew on the Gongyang textual tradition to reinterpret the Confucian tradition into a prophetic religious tradition for the entire humanity. So he argues that it is the Confucian tradition's access to the universal truths of human development, which would guide humanity toward the ultimate unity and equality that justifies the educated elite's tradition. In particular, he sees that both China's sage in antiquity and the modern West succeeded in building an integrated system of teaching and governing, as they both understand that the social relations formed through teaching and learning provides the basis of order for a successful civic life. The role of the cultural elite, therefore, is to find those constant universals in nature and translate them into institutions in order to guide the life of people. For him, the West has been particularly successful in building an integrated system through its parliamentary system, its institutionalized Christian religion, and its pursuit of universal laws through the practice of science. China, thus, needs to build a parliamentary monarchy, transforming Confucianism into a state religion. And the goal of elite learning ought to be abstracting universalistic reductionist principles to guide social and moral life. Therefore, for him, China's political modernity ought to inspire the goal of unifying the entire humankind, namely reaching the goal of the grand unity, Datong. And this mission is the essence of the Confucian tradition, and this essence falls on the shoulder of China's cultural elites. But Kang's vision was soon challenged. People who were identified with the evidential learning tradition had different answers. Liang Qichao, initially a close disciple of Kang, soon proposed a major challenge by around the time of the turns of the century. He argued that the Confucian tradition had never been a religion. It is not a tradition celebrating dogmatic indoctrination, Rather, it is a form of reflective political philosophy that celebrates self-reflection, autonomy, and responsibility. In his landmark work on renewing people, or 新民说, or new citizens, in 1902, he celebrated the newly translated term 民族主义 as the best political doctrine, and he interpreted it in the following way. He argues that there are no constant universals to define morality. Moral values change through history because the interests of the historical community change. Therefore, what is key here is to know what defines the common good for the community at a particular historical moment. Ancient sage kings in antiquity and the modern West are compatible in this regard. The problem of China's contemporary imperial system was that the imperial rulers today had treated China as their own private asset. In this sense, the goal of the political culture is to cultivate the understanding of what constitutes common good for the community as the basis for self-governance. And this is why it is so important to construct China, the nation, as the subject of historical knowledge. Here, he was the first person who used the term 中国 and to identify with China. Importantly, evoking Mencius, Liang argued that a dedication to common good would help to bring the best out of each individual, therefore transforming each individual into responsible, critically minded citizens. Thus, the conclusion is that the role of the educated elite is to guide people to identify themselves with the national spirit through understanding their shared history and culture. And such a national spirit, which he called 国性, is a cultural expression of individual agency, a reminder for the citizens of the best that they can be. At the same time, Liang launched two very important projects. One was his groundbreaking project under the title Neo-Historiography, 新史学, an enterprise of historiography that is transdynastic, cumulative, and progressive. It starts from the time of the sage kings in antiquity who created writings, unified the community, and built a shared civic cultural traditions. And his China is a civic integrationist cultural construction rooted in a reflective development of the common good. And in tune with his view of culture as the expression of individual agency, he saw national history as the progress of the community's political thinking, law building, philosophy, art, and literature across the community leaders' conscious life. Equally important here was his project of intellectual history, which celebrates the Qing evidential learning scholars not only as the intellectual model for his practice of his historiography, but also as the cultural and the political model for China's new citizens. But Liang Qichao was by no means the only influential voice. In fact, coming out of the evidential learning tradition, there was an alternative, even more radical positions in creating Kang Youwei. Zhang Taiyan, the most talented students of the philological method of evidential learning, presented a significant alternative. He joined the Kang's new learning movement around 1896, but quickly he became the harshest critique of Kang. By 1904, he published his most important political writing, Words Written in Oppression, 求书, which is a declaration of anti-Manchu revolution and an impressive interpretation of the roots and development of China's broad collective cultural traditions. He then became the leader of the revolutionary national learning movement and the most prestigious mentor and the propagandist for Sun Yat-sen's nationalist revolution movement. Same as Liang Qichao, Zhang Taiyan identified with evidential learning scholars as the real sage-lay tradition, and he also believed that they ought to serve as the model of China's new citizens. But he had a very different interpretation of what that tradition means. As a dedicated student of Xunzi, Zhang was highly skeptical toward any attempt of grounding values in nature, to the degree that it was impossible for him to acknowledge the possibility of inner moral faculty of human mind. Thus, he was very skeptical toward the doctrine of common good. For Liang, common good is possible precisely because individuals were born with moral intuition, or 良知. But since Zhang does not follow this assumption, the doctrine of a common good, as Liang proposed it, is therefore ungrounded and can become easily abused by the powerful, becoming a source of injustice. Therefore, there needs to be something more basic, materialistic, and authentic. Identifying himself with Wang Fuzhi, a 17th century evidential learning political thinker, Zhang's answer is race, or identity politics. It is the individual's commitment to the self-preservation of one's own kind, or in his word, 爱类, loving for one's own kind, rather than to realizing one's high spirit of autonomy that serves the most reliable and ethical foundation for civic life. How does this logic work? So while Liang Qichao sees culture as necessary for nurturing free agency and responsibility, Zhang Taiyan celebrated culture as a collective, continued symbolic force essential for material survival. Language, knowledge, customs, beliefs, these symbolic resources of a community are the product of a racial cultural group's interaction with environment, driven by their need of self-preservation and cultural development. They provide the social member necessary tools to maintain their livelihood. So a successful civic order heavily depends upon a community's protection of those symbolic resources. This is not only how sage kings in antiquity succeeded to protect the Han Chinese and build successful institutions, but it is also the reason why the white race of the West succeeded today. So given this, China today faced three challenges. The first is the decline of China's own government quality and learning since the Song, due to the rise of empty-minded, speculative, and self-indulgent learning in the Song, causing the backwardness of both China's government and culture. The second is the ongoing foreign rule of the Manchus, whose censorship of the Chinese political historical writing had greatly violated Han people's basic rights to their identity and livelihood, and created harmful institutions for the community. And last is that while the West could be an opportunity for China today to learn in order to restore from its cultural decline, the large amount of Western knowledge coming into China today and the hegemony of the Western culture would be a major challenge to China's own cultural interest. Thus, as China is increasingly becoming a part of the world, Chinese elites have the responsibility to strengthen China's own cultural development by protecting its own symbolic resources and strengthening its racial consciousness. Hence, Zhang presents a very different approach to national history and a different ideological outlook for the responsibility of the educated elite. For him, national history is not a progress of the Liang Qichao sense of national spirit contributed by the upper level of conscious life. Rather, it has the responsibility to maintain the growth and the continuity of the broad collective symbolic system. And China, or 中国, represents a spontaneous growth of the community's cultural institutions and customs in the everyday practice. The political and the moral connotation behind this is significant, and it would have a significant impact on the leftist cultural actors in the next generation. Zhang firmly believes that any construction of new progressive moral political norms and institutions has to understand and respect the existing shared norms of the everyday life of the community in order to guarantee the integrity of the elites. And in this sense, it is the evidential learning scholars, especially the philologists in the 18th century, that should serve as the model for the new citizens. Under the rule of the foreign elite in the Qing, they devoted themselves to reconstructing the broad collective cultural institutions since antiquity. For Zhang Taiyan, This indicates a sense of moral integrity that would be fundamental to the elite culture for China's future. By the time he served as the propagandist for the nationalist revolution, Zhang Taiyan had successfully transformed evidential learning into a powerful critique of any form of moral universalism as a cover-up for imperialism and cultural hegemony. Understanding justice through the lens of cultural equality, Zhang Taiyan also left a significant legacy in his critique of civil nationalism in Western liberal democracies as allowing the powerful and the rich to dominate the public interest. Both Liang and Zhang played significant roles in the 1911 nationalist revolution, but it was particularly Zhang Taiyan's anti-Manchu position, as well as his ability to reinterpret cultural traditions into a moral stand against injustice, that became extremely powerful and mobilizing. So what do we learn? Why does mapping out these three positions matter for us? I'm going to talk about three reasons. I think first, it can help us to understand why national thought emerged as an appealing choice and a mobilizing force among a broader community of literati scholars. Kang Youwei maintained his leadership position for a short period of time. By 1905, he was seriously challenged. His position was controversial at that moment. By the end of the Qing, China had lost its global standing, which had made it untenable for the intellectual elite to try to own any universalistic claims to values. In the presence of the powerful Western concept of universal history, Kang Youwei's highly reductionist interpretation of the Confucian learning would jeopardize the validity of the cumulative textual traditions of the Confucian learning that was key to the agency of the cultural elite that his reform movement intended to mobilize at the first place. However, Liang Qichao and Zhang Taiyan both shared evidential learning traditions' claim that to realize a good, beneficial civil order, political elite have to base the progress of the political life in a community's self-understanding and shared cultural meanings. Therefore, their historical approach to the definition of values could historicize both Chinese and the Western histories without arguing for the content of social political values in absolute terms. In doing so, the cultural elites were able to be cosmopolitan-minded, being a part of the world, while still maintaining the meaning of China's cultural traditions to define their authority and agency in Chinese society. The second reason why mapping out these positions is important is that it helps us to understand the ideological power of the imagination of a Chinese cultural identity. From a comparative perspective, the nationalist thinkers' promotion of popular rule or self-governance in the late Qing as a political doctrine was not so much based on the Western language of natural law theory, which was at the core of the French and American Revolution. Neither of them justified the modern state in China on a promise to a God-given equal rights to private property. Rather, they justified the modern self-governance on a cultural prospect of civic life. As we know, the key European theorists of the modern state in the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Pufendorf, John Locke, Adam Smith, they by and large agree that a modern political order is one based on a common vision of civilization that centers on commercial utility as the basis of social relations. However, for the Chinese nationalist thinkers, instead, they insist on theorizing a shared culture as fundamental to the community's political interests. Individuals achieve their social roles not through owning wealth and conducting commercial exchange, but through identifying themselves with the cultural development of the community. But such cultural needs are largely a product of its own history, thus have to be known from within. Hence, I believe that it is quite misleading to see that the modern Chinese nationalist history as an effort to translate the Western political doctrine. Rather, it is very much an exceptionalist cultural project that has great impact on various social and cultural sciences. At the heart of the nationalist thinkers' historiography and empirical studies, there is a deeply rooted theoretical assumption, which says there is a unified, coherent, and cumulative development of textual and cultural traditions that had been functioning to generate values, create social bonds, making the progress of civil life possible. The goal of the nationalist historiography as a form of political culture is to discover and re-identify with the common cultural interest through reconnecting with history. Therefore, the power of such a cultural project itself does not depend on the realization of a democratic political institution. Rather, it is gained through autonomous and collective development of scholarship across various disciplines of cultural sciences. And in a post-imperial world, this would give the cultural elites power in shaping public opinions, constructing ideologies, and conducting education. The last point I want to make about why we need to map out this position in Late Qing is that it shows us that it is equally important to see that there is by no means a unified vision of what this project ought to be. In fact, reconstructing the debate of the three figures help us to see that their different views of what culture means played a fundamental role in defining their social political visions. This ideological contention is an important reason why the debates over a Chinese cultural identity remains viable, and why there are competing modes of scholarly culture worth attention. Now, with these three conclusions, I want to shift to contemporary China. They will help us to make sense of what is happening today. If we assume that the ultimate goal of modern Chinese thought is westernization, then the revival of contemporary debates over the Chinese way would not make much sense. They would be seen as anti-globalist and exclusionist. But is it true? So after the end of the Cold War, China faced two major challenges. The first is the need for reform and opening up. The second is how to deal with what it leads. The reform and opening up in 1975 and 1979 eventually led to a significant democratization movement in 1989 that was brutally crushed by the government. But the government could not afford to go back to the isolationist and anti-intellectual state before the reform. In early 1990, the government continued its opening up and reform, joining the WTO in 2001. The revival of the debate over the Chinese way in the intellectual and academic world took place together with the government decision to deepen its investment in economic and educational globalization. Different from many popular nationalist movements today we see across the world, which turned to an exclusionist populist position, the turn to Chinese cultural identity is a way to continue being a part of the global world. What gives the discourse of Chinese uniqueness or the Chinese way a continued force among intellectuals, I believe, is that it creates a meaningful public domain for them to maintain their agency in public life above the government propaganda. For intellectuals, it gives them something that have a unique command over, and in this case, China's history and text. For the politician, there lies the same logic. Cultural identity gives them the right to be the final arbiters of values rather than influences and ideas they cannot control or own. And it is equally important to see that the return of the exceptionalist project is not simply rhetorical. Quite tellingly, under the return of China or civilization as prioritized categories, we see the revival of exactly the three positions that we have just seen in the Late Qing. It begins with the revival of Liang Qichao and Zhang Taiyan's two different historicist positions. But this revival also brought back the position of Kang Youwei, particularly in the recent context of China's rise as a global power. Let me quickly explain this. The first cluster, which I call the Chinese Humanism project, includes many leaders associated to the Chinese Enlightenment movement in the 80s and the national learning 国学 movement in the early 1990s. The philosopher Tang Yijie, Wang Yuanhua, and particularly Li Zehou had a background in Chinese philosophy, but embraced modern Western cultural philosophy. They loosely defined their goal as constructing a Chinese hermeneutics, or 中国诠释学, with the goal of taking the Chinese historical and cultural traditions seriously as a source of Chinese humanism. The most influential work in this first generation is Li Zehou's brilliant work on Chinese aesthetics, 美的历程, The Path of Beauty, a study of Chinese aesthetics. Among the students of those followers, of those figures, we also see a group of younger scholars picking up themes developed from this tradition. We have historian Zhao Guang sees his own cultural history and institutional history as following certain kind of paradigm of the new historiography developed by Liang Qichao and Hu Shi. And he has been interested in the origins of the continuous cultural consciousness in China's history that had held the community together. And we have intellectual historians and public intellectual Xu Jilin, who brought the harmonious idea of public sphere or civil society into conversation with the Confucian literati's vision of moral responsibility. And he envisions an intellectual culture that provides a discursive basis for the debate over the common good. Literary scholars Liu Dong helped to rebuild the Tsinghua Academy of National Learning, identifying his model with Liang Qichao. He has written much about the role of contemporary 国学, not only as a historical position of culture after 1980s, but also as brought back the also as a contribution or tool for the Chinese thinkers to critically construct, to critically contributing the global culture. At the same time, for others that shared similar positions, we also have Wang Mingming, an anthropologist, who want to rescue Liang Qichao's notion of China as an entity of civilization and integrationist silvicultural construct. By and large, these thinkers have been reviving some of the key concepts we've seen about culture in Liang Qichao's vision. So this is by and large a cultural liberal-minded direction. It focuses on the importance of shared culture as a project for nurturing public responsibility, individual moral insights, and humanistic spirit in a commercialized culture and the context of global nation state. But the second cluster I want to talk about is associated to the New Left movement, and especially the proposal of a Confucian socialism in recent years. Literary scholar, theorist, and intellectual historian Wang Hui is the most important leftist thinkers in contemporary China. He has largely reshaped the language and the pursuit of political values among intellectuals. He revived Zhang Taiyan and brought him to the center, linking Zhang's critique of Western cultural hegemony with Western Marxism and postdoctoralism, advancing a China-based critique of the package of Western modernity. Equally influential in this group is Gan Yang, a major philosopher and actor in the 80s who introduced many interwar European thinkers to China. Since the 2000s, he has been a major leader in reviving the studies of Chinese classical traditions in college education. Different from the position of the first cluster, he sees that the essence of tradition is rooted in the collective cultural consciousness in everyday life. Therefore, he linked Confucianism with the British tradition of socialism. Particularly, he advocated for an anti-Western cultural politics as the basis for constructing Chinese citizens' political agency. Others, such as Cui Zhiyuan, Wang Shaoguang, and Pan Wei, took the lead to argue for what has been often called the China model in political science and political theory, which tried to redefine China's success in contemporary global economy as an exceptional story from the modern Western model of market economy and liberal democracies. Their stories stress the commonalities and the continuity between the Confucian historical institutions and the communist institutions. They argue for building a new collectivist public philosophy drawing on these different legacies beyond the tradition of Western civil rights. In my view, this is probably the most influential and appealing direction in contemporary China. They have largely shared a key concept in the Zhang Taiyan's work, which involves a much more radical historicism and a view of culture as power for self-preservation and struggle. The need to construct a more authentic, historically rooted sense of political agency has made this group of thinkers to increasingly embrace ideals in Chinese traditions that support an more all-encompassing authoritarian model of government against the Western party politics and the representative system. The last cluster I want to briefly talk about is the movement of the so-called political Confucians. It celebrates Kang Youwei's vision of the Confucian religion and adopts the Gongyang school's language of Confucian tradition as a universalistic, revealed tradition. It argues against the nationalist view of the Confucian tradition and advocated for the ideal of Zhongguo as representing the kingly way to the entire world, therefore supporting certain kind of ideas of constitutional monarchy and the vision of integrated system of teaching and law. The leaders of the movement, such as Jiang Qing, Chen Ming, they first became known in the mid-90s, but it is only after the mid of the 2000s, after the new left movement had problematized the Western liberal vision of global modernity, that this group became increasingly attractive to people in classical studies and Chinese philosophy. On the one hand, thinkers associated to these clusters have been known for arguing for some extremely conservative social values, often taking ancient discourses at their face value. But on the other hand, it also inspired philosophers to imagine an alternative global philosophy from the existing one based on the competition of nation state. And as we know, Zhao Tianyang's effort to construct a more ethical world philosophy, centering on the concept of traditional ideas of tianxia, is an example. So these intellectual clusters debate with each other. They build their own cultural enterprises and platforms. They influence policymakers and shape education. For the government, this means they can choose the one that is most helpful for them to deal with particular issues at a particular moment, such as ethnic policies, social tensions, and international politics. But this also means for the state, it is preferred that these positions are not unified. This contested situation of the ideology might explain why Xi Jinping had found it necessary to strengthen its control of power and maintain a certain level of personality cult. But explaining how these clusters debate with each other and shaped different domestic policies have gone beyond the scope of this talk. In this talk, I have argued that it is not adequate to see modern Chinese national thought and the pursuit of identity as a product of Western-style modernization. Rather, it was born from a debate, ongoing debate over the source of shared values and the role of elite culture. I hope that by showing how the matter of identity became central to those political debates, and by mapping out the main positions in this debate, I have given you a useful perspective to better understand the contemporary Chinese ideological landscape, especially the theoretical and textual basis for these contesting historical visions over China's future political identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wenyu, for such a comprehensive and far-reaching discussion. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure our other listeners did too. We are very close to the end of time. So I do invite, we might be able to manage one question before we need to finish promptly at 1 o'clock. So if anybody would like to ask questions, please type them into the Q&A, and I will be able to read them and moderate them we have several questions. Okay. So Mary Gallagher says, thank you for the interesting talk. How did the evidentiary learning approach affect how these thinkers thought about national boundaries and definitions of who is Chinese? Was it defined by cultural practices, languages, or something else?
To answer this question, this is a very interesting question. So for the evidential learning traditions, especially the way that they generate impact on the nationalist thinkers, they have a particular concern over the continuity of civic institutions or cultural institutions that they see in, for instance, language as a very important civic institution, and also especially the textual tradition. And by that, they mean a cumulative textual tradition starting from the antiquity, and which was defined by the Confucian practice of commentary. So for them, the reason why they see language and they see, in some case, for instance, in Zhang Taiyan, that identity or racial identity matters, is that they think that those institutions or those textual traditions have been particularly important in connecting or in creating a cohesion or cultural cohesion to tie the different groups who are interested in a Chinese ideal of a civic life and civilization. So language matters, and in the case of Zhang Taiyan, race matters, but race is a very radical position. But overall, it is the idea that it is some kind of civic construction or construction of a cultural ideal guided by the Confucian classic textual tradition that defines who the Chinese should be, who should be the Chinese.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more. So I'm going to ask Xiao Fenhong. So Tim Shen asks, what is the connection of Xiao Fenhong and the three clusters?
Xiao Fenhong, I think Xiao Fenhong is a very interesting phenomenon. It is
so just as a translation for those who are non-Chinese speakers, Little Spring.
So these are, I would say that they are followers of particularly two positions that argue for the exceptional or the exceptionalist or the priority of China's model, particularly a follower of this idea of China's model as superior to the West. And I think it is so first of all, Xiao Fenhong is a phenomenon, is a cultural phenomenon that appeared mostly in digital platforms and in internet. And I think it's a particularly phenomenon that becomes popular in the mid of 2000, especially after 2008. And it is, we don't see this in the early stage of the project of Chinese humanism, but especially we see it as an important cultural phenomenon after the mid 2000, especially the late 2000, when particularly the China model discourse and the ideas of the socialist, Confucian socialist ideas became more dominant in guiding people to think what China's future identity should be. And I think it's overall a cultural phenomenon in the internet and among popular followers, but it certainly became possible and became popular after the mid of 2000, when the second cluster and third cluster became more pronounced in the intellectual world.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your talk. It's now 1 o'clock, and I want to thank you for the excellent talk and thank everybody for coming. And I hope to see everybody in 2 weeks when we will have a talk by Brian Wu. Thank you so much. Goodbye.